Hi, everyone. I am David Lipton from The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. Welcome to our 21st in a series of weekly podcasts. In my last podcast, we discussed a new political vision dedicated to the sustainability of our republic, the FCSLFD coalition. In this podcast, we will continue the themes of the previous two podcasts of reviving our American creed by adopting the FCSLFD vision and applying it vigorously and consistently to the defense of our country and of the West. We named this podcast The Shield of the West Crumbles. Clarity, purpose, determination, and effective leadership is what this podcast is all about. America is the shield of the West. Never forget that. Our leaders must never forget that. Let's start with the facts and with clarity. Did you know that for the first time in its history, the federal government spent more on interest payments than on the defense of our country? That is $870 billion on interest payments versus $802 billion for national defense. Do those numbers feel right to you? I believe we are heading in the wrong direction. Remember, facts can be stubborn things. Let's look at the chart for spending by the Defense Department from 1952 to 2024. Spending as a percentage of GDP has declined from 16.9% under President Truman to 8.6% in 1967 under President Johnson, to 6.8% in 1983 under President Reagan, to 4.7% in 2000 under President Obama, and to 3% in 2024 under President Biden. Startling, is it not? Under Democrat and Republican presidents, the persistent decline in military spending stands out for all to see. For a variety of reasons, Democrat and Republican administrations have opted for reduced military spending. What do you think our friends and enemies abroad will make of that trend? My guess is they would conclude that Americans are more interested in their own affairs than in foreign affairs. Let's change our focus from the past 70 years to a 200-year pattern of U.S. foreign interventions. There are two remarkable long-term patterns to U.S. foreign policy from 1823 to 2024. The first is one of expansion, and the second one of expansion, stability, and then contraction. From 1823 to 1950, the trend was a continuous outward expansion from our shores, across oceans into the Eastern Hemisphere. From 1953 to 2024, the expansion halted and then started to erode. It did not matter if the President of the United States was a Republican or a Democrat. The power of the United States either waxed or waned within that contracting sphere. Today, we fight not to lose rather than to subdue our opponents. We have become timid, and that is a problem. The one unintended consequence of our expansion and contraction, of our presence abroad, was the increasing strategic dependence of our allies on our military presence and a foreign policy to back it up. The U.S. became the shield defending the Western world from our enemies, as well as keeping those enemies far away from our shores. Going forward, what is to be done? I suggest keeping a firm grip of what our strategic interests abroad really are, and we think clearly about our need for hemispheric defense. The fundamental strategic interest of the United States has remained the same since 1914. The U.S. is in effect a continental island and operates as all maritime empires have done since time immemorial. Looking at a map of the world can focus our minds. Look at a flat projection map of the world with the U.S. in the middle of the map, with the Pacific Ocean and Asia to the left, and the Atlantic Ocean and Europe to the right. As applied to U.S. circumstances, the strategy requires that our nation always pursue the following policies. 1. The maintenance of unobstructed sea lanes and air lanes to connect and trade with the rest of the world, Canada and Mexico excepted. 2. Prevention of any combination of external forces, be they nations or loosely directed organizations, which might weaken U.S. commercial and political bonds and alliances beyond our shores. 3. The U.S. must ensure it offers its friends and its enemies abroad a greater incentive to deal with the U.S. than with each other. Otherwise, U.S. influence and its ability to act abroad will decline. We have been remiss in consistently following those policies. That brings us back to the harsh reality of $870 billion spent on interest payments and $822 billion spent on national defense. These numbers show we are moving in the wrong direction if we are to shield ourselves and our allies from the enemies of the West. Are we ready to reverse that trend? Hemispheric defense requires a forward defense policy where we can project effectively and consistently our military force into the Eastern Hemisphere. That ability is dependent on our fiscal ability and willingness to support that effort. That, in its turn, means having the industrial capacity to produce the necessary weaponry and ammunition, which means that we invest in smaller, more nimble weapons platforms, more software, and retrain more of our military personnel so that they can deliver our military might in the right way at the right time. The U.S. is currently ready to fight, or refight, the Second World War by relying on outdated and vulnerable platforms such as aircraft carriers and heavy tanks. This kind of thinking will not do. The aircraft carriers would be vulnerable to all kinds of missile attacks, and the tanks would become magnets for heavily armed drones, used by troops anywhere from 1,000 feet to several miles away. If you have any doubts about this, look at how the Ukrainians have immobilized the Russian Black Sea Fleet without a navy, or stopped the Russian army with swarms of drones, land-based missiles, and long-range artillery guided by computer software. There is also the example of Israel's remarkable ability to use and rely on cyber warfare and drones to identify and kill their enemies in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Cyber warfare and drones have changed everything. Masses of troops and tanks will not work anymore. The timely release of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy in August of 2024 is the proverbial fire bell in the night. Actually, it was rung in broad daylight. The report is a much-needed antidote to our head-in-the-sand, foot-dragging approach to events abroad. We are constantly reacting to our enemies' actions rather than actively anticipating them. Physical distance, principally the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, has a lot to do with our problem, and that is a very big problem. Let's again sharpen our focus in our minds by further revisiting the graphs of military spending and debt increases as measured by the percentage of GDP over a 70-year period. These charts clearly show that we must wake up to the connection between our rising debt service and our declining financial ability and willingness to defend the Republic abroad. Those trends reflect our growing inclination to turn our backs on the rest of the world and of discarding our shield of the West. People and nations are impressed when one's home is kept in good financial order. Our national home is not. Our current disorder, both politically and economically, is obvious to all. When our total national debt over a 50-year period has grown more than 3 times faster than our national GDP, and the domestic political situation borders on paralysis, our enemies in the Eastern Hemisphere sense weakness and indecision. They will likely believe that the steady erosion of U.S. economic and financial power will erode our ability and willingness to project our force abroad. They may be right. To reinforce our argument for a forward defense policy, here are some more graphs and charts for you to look at. First, there's the skyrocketing debt from 35% of the GDP in 1970 to 122% of GDP in 2022. Second, the steady decline of U.S. spending as a percentage of GDP from just under 17% during the Korean War to 3% today. The unintended consequences of U.S. supremacy is the strategic dependence of our allies and friends on our continued strength. If we falter, they will falter. If the American colossus becomes first financially and then unwilling politically to lead, we will have entered a world where the triumph of evil becomes possible because good men will do nothing. We may convince ourselves that U.S. restraint is a virtue. Our friends and enemies abroad may draw another conclusion, that we are getting weaker, less willing, and less able to sustain extended military commitments abroad. Our strategic interests require that we not only make our presence felt, but that we hold the line by actively and aggressively helping our allies in their fight against the bad actors in this world. America is the shield of the West. Never forget that. Our leaders must never forget that. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to my channel and refer us to your friends and colleagues. You will hear from me, David Lipton, in a week's time, and you can access my ideas and thoughts by visiting the Amazon.com site and search for my ebook, The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030.